You are telling me that the difference between a Nazi victory and an Allied breakthrough in 1944 wasn't always a Sherman tank or a Garand rifle, but sometimes just a bicycle pump and a bunch of guys from art school?
It sounds like a punchline from a bad sitcom, but it is the absolute documented truth. We're talking about the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known to history as the Ghost Army. 1,100 men, artists, illustrators, radio operators, and sound engineers, whose entire job was to be seen where the real army wasn't. They were a traveling roadshow of deception that saved between 15 and 30,000 American lives, and they did it with balloons.
Hang on, 30,000 lives? That is not a rounding error. That is several entire divisions. How does a guy with a paintbrush save 30,000 soldiers from the Wehrmacht?
By making the Germans believe they were facing a ghost. Think about the stress of a German general in 1944. You're sitting in a bunker, staring at aerial reconnaissance photos, listening to intercepted radio chatter. You see a massive armored division moving into your flank. You see the tanks, you hear the engines at night, you see the MPs directing traffic. So what do? You move your panzers to meet them. You pivot your artillery. And the moment you do that, the real US Army hits you from 20 miles away where you just left a hole in your line.
And when the Germans finally hit the unit they thought was there?
They hit air, literally. They would open fire with 88mm cannons on what they thought were M4 Sherman tanks, and the tanks would just pop.
This is insane. Who recruits for this? You don't go to a drill sergeant and ask for the best muralist in New York City.
That is exactly what they did. January 1944, Camp Forest, Tennessee. The Army puts Colonel Harry Reeder in charge. He's the engineer logic and pairs him with Major Ralph Ingersoll. Now, Ingersoll is the key. In civilian life, he was the editor of Fortune magazine. He understood perception. He understood media. They went to the Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, the Art Students League of New York. They recruited Disney animators, Broadway set designers, Madison Avenue advertising executives.
So the front line of the war was being held by guys who 3 months earlier were drawing Mickey Mouse or designing lipstick ads?
Exactly. The average age was 22. These weren't combat vets. They were kids who could sketch a landscape in 10 minutes. And their arsenal, it wasn't bullets, it was the tech arsenal of the 23rd. It had 3 legs. The first was visual deception.
The balloons.
Right. They had over 200 inflatables. These were made by the Good Enough Rubber Company. We're talking full-scale M4 Shermans, Jeeps, trucks, and even 105mm guns. A real Sherman tank weighs 60 tons. A Ghost Army Sherman weighed 80 pounds.
Wait, 80 pounds? I could lift a tank?
2 guys could lift a tank and walk away with it. There's actually a famous story where a couple of French locals saw 2 American GIs pick up a tank and carry it across a field. The Frenchmen supposedly nearly had a heart attack because they thought the Americans had developed super soldier strength. But these things were detailed. From the air, at 500 feet, you could not tell the difference. They had foot bellows and electric fans that could inflate a battalion in 30 minutes.
But tanks make noise. You can't just have a silent tank farm in the middle of a forest. The Germans aren't stupid.
That brings us to the second leg, sonic deception. This is where it gets Hollywood. They had 28 half-tracks fitted with massive Chrysler speakers. These things were monsters. They could project sound for 15 miles. They went to Fort Knox and recorded the sounds of tanks idling, shifting gears, clanking their treads. They even recorded the sound of soldiers swearing and building bridges.
They scripted the war.
Literally, they had sound engineers mixing these tracks like a studio album. At night, they would drive these sound trucks near the German lines and play the sound of an entire armored division moving into position. The Germans would hear the rumble, they would hear the clank of the metal, and they would map it. They would report back to Berlin. The Americans are massing for an attack.
It's a magic trick on a continental scale.
And the third leg was the radio ploy. You have 250 men in a signal company. Their only job was spoofing. They would create fake radio nets. They knew the Germans were listening to the Morse code and the voice traffic, so they would impersonate the radio operators of real units, like the 1st Armored. They would talk about laundry, fuel deliveries, orders from HQ, all nonsense, but it created a digital footprint of an army that didn't exist.
So if I'm a German intelligence officer, I see the tanks in the photos, I hear the tanks at night, and my radio intercepts confirm the unit is there. All 3 senses are being lied to.
Precisely, and they added atmospherics. This is my favorite part. They would send ghost army soldiers into local French towns wearing the patches of the units they were faking. They would go into a bistro, have a drink, and accidentally let it slip that they were with the 2nd Armored. They knew the spies in the bars would report it. They even had fake MPs at crossroads directing imaginary traffic. They would drive 2 real trucks in a circle for 4 hours to create dust clouds and tire tracks so the aerial recon looked authentic.
That is unreal. So when does this actually matter? Give me a moment where this saved the day.
Let's talk about Operation Bettingberg, September 1944. General Patton has a problem. His 3rd Army is stretched thin. He has a 20-mile gap in his line near Luxembourg. If the Germans realize it's empty, they can punch right through and wreck his entire flank. He has nothing to put there.
So he calls the artists.
He calls the Ghosts. They move in and impersonate the 6th Armored Division. They set up the rubber tanks, they blast the sound of tank engines 24 hours a day, they flood the radio waves. The Germans probe the line, they see the armor, they hear the movement, and they stop. They refuse to attack because they think they're outnumbered.
For how long?
7 days. For one entire week, 1,100 artists held a 20-mile front against the Wehrmacht, using nothing but balloons and loudspeakers. Colonel Simonson called it the first professional execution of the unit. They held the line while Patton regrouped his real armor.
But these guys they're unarmed, right? Or at least they're not combat troops. What happens if a German patrol actually walks up to one of these tanks?
That was the nightmare. They were often operating just 200 to 500 yards from the German lines. If a German sergeant decides to get brave and walks across that field with a bayonet, the whole illusion vanishes. There were close calls. They lost men. 2 men were killed by artillery and mines. One Ghost Army truck was actually strafed by an American P-51 Mustang because even our own pilots thought the fake units were real.
That is the ultimate compliment and the ultimate danger. You lie so well, your friends try to kill you?
Exactly. The motto of the unit was spook and spookery. But the climax, the big one, was Operation Viersen, March 1945. This is the Rhine crossing, the final push into Germany.
The end game.
The Allies need to get across the Rhine River. It's a massively defended barrier. The 9th Army is preparing to cross at one point. The Ghost Army is ordered to fake a crossing at a different point, near Viersen. They set up 1,000 inflatable vehicles. They simulate the sound of huge bridge-building operations. They use smoke pots to hide their fake work.
Does it work?
It works too well. The Germans are convinced. They move their entire defensive weight to Viersen. They send 7 reconnaissance flights over the Ghost positions. They shell the rubber tanks. And while the Germans are busy shooting at balloons, the real 9th Army crosses the Rhine 10 miles away with almost 0 casualties.
0 casualties on a Rhine crossing? That's unheard of.
That one operation alone is estimated to have saved 10,000 lives. 10,000 fathers, sons, and brothers who got to go home because some kid from Brooklyn knew how to stitch a rubber tank.
And yet, we never heard about them. I didn't grow up watching Ghost Army movies. Why is this secret?
It was classified for 40 years. The Pentagon didn't want the Soviet Union to know how good we were at deception. The men were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't tell their wives, they couldn't tell their children. They didn't get Purple Hearts for being shelled, because officially, they weren't there.
So they come home, they put away the patches, and they just go back to art?
They did, and this is the wild part. Because they were artists, they spent the entire war sketching. When they weren't inflating tanks, they were drawing the French countryside, the locals, and each other. Those sketches are now in museums. It is one of the most documented units in the war, but only through art.
It wasn't until 1996 that the world found out.
96 is when the records were declassified, and it took until 2024, just recently, for them to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. There were only about a dozen of them left alive to see it, men in their late 90s and hundreds.
It's a staggering legacy. We talk about firepower and industrial might winning the war, but this was imagination winning the war.
Imagination and balls of steel. Imagine sitting in a foxhole next to a rubber balloon, knowing a panzer division is zeroing in on you, and your only defense is a loudspeaker playing a tape loop.
That's not just art, that's insanity.
That's warfare. Let's look at the technical friction of this, because it wasn't just set it and forget it. These guys were performing a 24-hour-a-day theater piece in the middle of a war zone. Think about the physicality of it. You have these M4 Shermans. They are made of heavy-duty rubber, and they are prone to punctures.
Wait, so if a stray piece of shrapnel hits your tank, it doesn't just dent?
It hisses, it deflates. There are stories of Ghost Army soldiers running out into a field under artillery fire with glue and cigarette lighters to patch a tank before the next German recon plane flew over. Because if a Luftwaffe pilot sees a soggy, half-melted Sherman, the gig is up. The whole army is revealed as a sham.
That is terrifying. You're a painter from Pratt, and you're betting your life on a patch kit?
And the sound trucks, these Chrysler multi-speakered monsters, they weren't just loud, they were directional. The engineers had to calculate the acoustics of the forest. If the wind shifted, the Germans might hear the clank of a tank coming from the treetops instead of the road. They had to mix the audio live. They had scripts written by Hollywood screenwriters that dictated exactly when the fake soldiers should shout or clank a wrench against a pipe.
It's Foley work. They were doing live Foley for an audience of Nazis.
Exactly. And the danger wasn't just German fire, it was friendly fire. Think about the infantry units nearby. If the 23rd is doing their job right, the neighboring American units think there is a massive armored division on their flank. But if those infantrymen wander over to borrow some sugar or cigarettes, they find a bunch of guys with paintbrushes and rubber toys.
So they had to lie to their own side too?
They had to. The security was so tight that even local American commanders often didn't know what the Ghost Army was. They were ghosts to everyone. There's this incredible moment during the Battle of the Bulge, Operation Camp 20.
The Bulge. That was the breaking point for the Allies.
It was chaos. The Germans had punched a massive hole in the lines. The Ghost Army was ordered to step in near the Rhine to act as the 12th Corps. We're talking about 10,000 men and 150 tanks that did not exist. They set up the inflatables. They blared the sound of engines through the snow.
In the middle of a counteroffensive?
Right in the teeth of it. The Germans sent 7 different reconnaissance flights to check the sector. Each time, the pilots reported back, the Americans have a massive reserve of armor here. The Germans were so convinced that they diverted 2 full infantry attacks away from the real crossing points to hit the ghosts.
And what happened when the infantry hit the balloons?
The ghosts would wait until the last second, pack up their rubber tanks in 30 minutes, and vanish into the woods. The Germans would arrive at an empty field. It was psychological warfare at its peak. They were gaslighting the Third Reich.
I am obsessed with the recruitment side of this. You mentioned Disney animators. Who were these guys specifically?
Names you'd recognize later. Bill Blass, the fashion designer. He was a ghost. Ellsworth Kelly, the minimalist painter. Arthur Singer, the wildlife artist. These guys weren't just faking tanks, they were observing the world. They carried sketchbooks everywhere. While they were waiting for the next operation, they were drawing the ruins of France. They were capturing the humanity of the war while they were busy creating its illusions.
It's almost poetic. They're using art to preserve life while everyone else is using machinery to destroy it.
That is the core of the legacy. When they were disbanded in July 1945 at Camp Shanks, they were told, if you talk about this, you're violating the Espionage Act. So these artists went back to New York and Paris. They became famous designers and painters, and for 50 years they kept the secret.
Imagine being Bill Blass at a high society party in the 60s and someone asks you what you did in the war and you just have to say, "Oh, I was just an engineer."
Just an engineer. Meanwhile, he was personally responsible for tricking a panzer commander into retreating. The impact is staggering. 10 German divisions were fooled over the course of 22 operations, from Brest to Veer to the Rhine.
And the gold medal, that happened recently?
2024, Biden signed it. It took 80 years for the United States to say thank you for the balloons. There were only a handful of them left. Men like Seymour Nussenbaum and John Christman. They were 100 years old, finally getting to wear the Ghost Army patch in public.
Let's go deeper into the Brest operation. This was the first time they really let the ghost off the leash. August 1944. The Allies are trying to take this vital port in Brittany. The Germans are dug in like ticks.
This is where the identity theft started. The Ghosts were told to impersonate the 6th Armored Division, but they didn't just put out the tanks. They had to create the vibe of a division. They had guys pretending to be drunk and rowdy in the local villages, wearing 6th Armored patches. They had trucks with the 6th insignia painted on the doors in washable paint.
Washable paint?
Because the next day, they might have to be the 79th Infantry. They were chameleons. At Brest, they convinced the German commander that he was surrounded by a force 3 times larger than what was actually there. The Germans wasted thousands of rounds of precious ammunition shelling empty fields where the rubber tanks were sitting.
Every shell they fired at a balloon was a shell that didn't hit an American soldier.
Exactly. And the Veer operation, that was pure adrenaline. They were inflating 500 vehicles while the 2nd Panzer Division was just a few miles away. They were operating in the dark using electric fans powered by generators that they had to muffle with blankets so the Germans wouldn't hear the motors of the pumps before the speakers started playing the tank sounds.
It's a balancing act. If you pump too loud, they know. If you don't pump enough, the tank wilts.
There were times where a tank would lose air during the day, and a ghost soldier would have to crawl out into the field with a hand pump while snipers were active just to keep the illusion upright. It was nerve-wracking. They weren't trained for this, remember? These were creative kids, they were sensitive types, and they were sitting ducks.
Why didn't the Germans just send a scout over the hill?
Because of the sonic deception. The sound was visceral. It didn't just sound like tanks, it felt like tanks. Those Chrysler speakers moved air. You could feel the vibration in your chest from a mile away. To a German scout, that rumble meant certain death if he poked his head over that ridge. They used fear as a cloaking device.
And the radio guys, they were the unsung heroes of the unsung heroes.
The signal company was brilliant. They studied the fist of the German radio operators. Every telegraph operator has a fist, a unique rhythm and style of tapping out Morse code. The ghost operators would mimic the real American units' fists. They would make mistakes. They would complain about the food in code. They made the German interceptors believe they were listening to real, bored soldiers instead of a highly coordinated intelligence operation.
It's method acting for the War Department.
Marlon Brando had nothing on these guys. Then came Operation Malls in November 1944, near Metz. They faked the 90th Infantry Division. They held the Panzers at bay for 8 days. 8 days of bluffing with a pair of twos against a full house. That delay enabled Patton to execute his famous flank maneuver.
If the ghosts don't hold that line, Patton doesn't get his glory.
Patton knew it too. He was one of the biggest supporters of the 23rd. He loved misdirection. He understood that one well-placed lie was worth 10 battalions. But even with Patton's support, they were still outcasts. They didn't fit into the standard army structure. They were weirdos. They had long hair by army standards. They were sketching when they should have been cleaning their rifles.
But when the Rhine needed crossing, the weirdos were the ones they called.
Operation Viersen is the masterpiece. They had 1,000 fake vehicles, they had fake landing craft, they had smoke generators creating a massive fog bank. The Germans were so panicked by the buildup at Viersen that they pulled reserve divisions from all over the front. When the real attack happened at Wessel, the Germans were staring the wrong way. It was the greatest disappearing act in military history.
And when it was over, they just disappeared themselves.
Disbanded July 15, 1945. They went back to New York, they went back to Chicago, they went back to art schools, and they shut their mouths. For 40 decades, this incredible achievement was buried in basements and archives.
What was the turning point? How did Rick Beyer find them?
Beyer and the Ghost Army Legacy Project started hunting down the survivors in the early 2000s. He realized that these artists had hundreds of sketches of the war that nobody had ever seen. He started piecing it together. The interviews are heartbreaking and hilarious. These old men talking about pumping up a tank while artillery was raining down.
They finally got their due in 2024.
The Congressional Gold Medal. It is the highest expression of national appreciation for distinguished achievements, and for the Ghost Army, it was long overdue. They saved thousands of families from receiving a Western Union telegram saying their son wasn't coming home. They fought with wit and creativity.
It's the ultimate revenge of the art majors.
Never underestimate a kid with a sketchbook and a rubber tank.